Carl Laemmle loved ceremony and he loved people. He knew what people wanted. By the time he formed Universal, he was 40 years old. But Laemmle created something that would last forever.
Laemmle was born in Germany in 1867. When he was 17, he persuaded his father that his future lay in America. And so he bought himself a ticket to come to the United States.
Like the story of so many other immigrants, just had a couple bucks in his pocket. But he held down a number of odd jobs and finally became established in Oshkosh, Wisconsin. And it was on a trip from Oshkosh to Chicago in 1906 that Carl Laemmle saw his first Nickelodeon.
He watched as people were lining up to pay nickels to go into this new thing called a Nickelodeon. And he counted the number of people going in, figured out what the rent would be, and realized he was in the wrong business.
In time, he not only was one of the biggest owners of Nickelodeons and movie theaters, he was one of the biggest exchange owners in the Midwest and the United States. Like many other founding moguls, he began to look at production.
He formed a company in 1909 called the Independent Moving Pictures Company and made his first film in 1909, a Western called Hiawatha, based on the famous epic poem.
Then Carl Laemmle partnered with 5 other independent producers to create Universal in 1912.
And the first film that they distributed was a film called Traffic in Souls.
And it dealt with the sensation of white slavery, kidnapping young girls and putting them into a life of prostitution, all shot on location in New York.
So it was a huge success. And it really was an indication that Universal could go for a larger audience.
It was really pioneering in its time. And Carl Laemmle was innovative in many ways.
Laemmle Sr. was one of the pioneers in the star system. He understood that movie audiences now wanted something more than just going to see a movie. What's the next attraction? Well, let's create somebody you actually want to go see and put the spotlight on an actor or an actress. He helped pioneer the large studio where you could do everything on your studio lot.
Universal had everything that a city had. It was all just a wonderland.
He was a real visionary. I mean, he's the one who saw the land in the San Fernando Valley and realized its potential for becoming a movie-making capital.
And then he became the first entrepreneur to actually organize studio tours.
They invited the general public to come to the studio and see how movies were made. They were able to do that because it was the silent era. So they encouraged the crowd to boo all of the villains and to cheer the heroes.
He was a showman. He understood that the show didn't just occur on the screen, but that Americans were fascinated by this new industry.
So from the beginning, he saw a lot of the things that would develop into the modern Universal Studios. The kind of movies that were being made, the ambitions that he had for the movie business and for Universal in those early days. He never lost his immigrant's attitude toward things. He saw the business in a kind of a familial way.
He was known as Uncle Carl. And he always had at least 80 members of his family working in the studio. And there was an old ditty that went around that Carl Laemmle has a big family. And that was because he was also known as a soft touch.
Part of his attitude about family and the business is that, of course, his son, Carl Laemmle Jr., was really groomed from the beginning to take over the business that Carl Laemmle Sr. had started. He had been there from the beginning. He'd lived, you know, the production every day. And essentially, on his 21st birthday, he was given the studio to take over.
Carl Laemmle Jr. was much less interested in the bread and butter pictures that Universal made. He wanted the prestige, and so he embarked on a number of efforts. One of the things that most people today have no conception of is just how divided the country was along racial lines in the wake of the Civil War. So to make a picture like Imitation of Life, in which this black woman essentially becomes the equal and the partner of this white woman, was a very brave thing to do.
Oh, it ain't her fault, Miss B. It ain't yours and it ain't mine.
In Germany, in the silent era, there was a movement called Expressionism. They were certainly very eerie and powerful films. That inspired Carl Laemmle Jr. to go into the horror monster genre.
I am Dracula.
And sure enough, these films are hugely successful for Universal.
It's alive! It's alive! It's alive!
But with the early monster movies, Universal right away began to see that people wanted to see these characters again, and so they began doing these franchises.
We belong dead.
The Bride of Frankenstein, some consider even a better film than the first.
And that eventually became standard practice in the industry. But the Laemmles were really at the forefront of figuring this out and actually doing it.
And in 1930, Carl Laemmle Jr. and Sr. produced All Quiet on the Western Front.
All Quiet on the Western Front is one of their first big prestige films. This is their first film that gets them an Academy Award, and it marks a big breakthrough for Universal.
It's very controversial at the time that you would do a film from the enemy's point of view. I think in some ways it was a personal story. I mean, Laemmle certainly never cut off his ties with Germany.
Every year after he made it, he would go back to Laemmle in Germany, where he was born. And he would go and see his relatives, and he would give money to people to help them, and all of that. And never forgot his roots.
At this point, he was winding down his own career as a hands-on producer. And by the very late 20s, and particularly by 1930, once he saw Hitler and the National Socialists coming into power, he saw the handwriting on the wall. And what he did is he brought over personally 300 people, many of them members of his family, but other Jews from his town and neighboring villages. He used his own personal wealth to save all these families. And he did it very quietly. I mean, he wasn't trying to grab the headlines with it. He was that kind of a man.
I don't know how many families he brought over to this country and helped give them jobs or find jobs for them. He was just wonderful in that area. He was beloved by everybody that worked for him. Coming as a young guy, you know, from Germany, and he ended up with the biggest movie studio in the world. He was just an amazing man.
So yeah, I think some of that Laemmle spirit has continued to this day. And whether it's in the water or just being there on the property or osmosis, whatever it is, there's still an element of that at Universal.